In this video, we're looking at the deadliest food accidents ever recorded, from a group of students who shared a fruit that quietly shut their bodies down overnight, to a sealed kimchi that looked completely safe, until opening it turned the air itself into something deadly. It was January 12, 2017, in a rented hillside home outside Gangneung. The property had been vacant for months between bookings, sealed through the winter with little ventilation. From the outside, it looked clean and ready, nothing suggesting anything had been left behind inside. One of the guests arriving that afternoon was Samuel Park, 20, a university student and freelance graphic designer. The trip had been planned casually with a small group of friends, just a few days away to rest. People who knew Samuel described him as careful and observant, someone who paid attention to details and rarely acted without thinking. After arriving, the group moved through the house slowly, unpacking and settling in. The windows were closed, and the kitchen felt warm and still, with no airflow or exhaust running. The air inside was stale, like it had been sealed for a long time, but nothing stood out as immediately wrong. While organizing food, Samuel opened a lower door near the back wall. It led to a small storage room, partially below ground level. The space was narrow, with concrete walls and no visible ventilation. Inside were several large plastic containers stacked along the floor, older fermentation batches left behind by the previous occupant. Most were labeled, though the writing had faded. Several contained kimchi, stored in bulk containers commonly used for long-term fermentation. Some lids were sealed tightly, while others showed minor warping from internal gas buildup. The room carried a strong fermented odor, sharper than what would normally be noticed in an open kitchen. Samuel stepped inside to inspect the containers more closely. He lifted the lid of one near the front. A brief release of gas followed, noticeable but not forceful. He set it aside and moved deeper into the room, closer to the back where more containers were stacked. Within that enclosed space, carbon dioxide had been slowly accumulating over time. The fermentation process inside multiple sealed containers had continued, releasing gas that settled in the lower part of the room. With no airflow to disperse it, the concentration near floor level had gradually increased. As Samuel crouched to check another container, his head moved into that lower layer. His movement slowed first. He shifted his weight slightly, one hand pressing against the container to steady himself. His breathing became shallow. He tried to stand, but didn't fully straighten before losing balance. He collapsed forward onto the floor of the storage room. The sound carried into the kitchen. A friend nearby entered and found him down inside the storage space. From the doorway, nothing looked disturbed. No broken objects, no signs of impact. Assuming he had fainted, the friend stepped in and bent down to lift him. As he moved lower, his breathing changed. He paused mid-movement, his posture slackening. He tried to adjust his footing but lost strength in his legs and dropped beside Samuel. Another friend followed shortly after. Seeing both of them on the floor, he moved in quickly. He reached down, pulling at one of their arms, but as he lowered himself into the same confined space, his coordination declined. He slowed, then stopped moving with control before collapsing near the entrance. By the time a fourth person arrived, 3 were already down inside the storage room. She stepped toward the doorway but hesitated, noticing something off in how still the space felt. Instead of entering fully, she pulled back and called out for help. A 5th friend approached but stayed outside the room. From where he stood, there were no clear signs of what had happened, just multiple people on the floor, unresponsive. He did not enter and called emergency services immediately. Responders arrived and identified the storage room as a confined space hazard. They ventilated the area before entry and used breathing equipment to extract the victims. Samuel and 2 others were unresponsive. One had a weak pulse and irregular breathing. The rest were outside the exposure zone. All were transported to the hospital. Samuel and 2 others died shortly after. The 4th remained in critical condition under respiratory support. The cause was traced to accumulated carbon dioxide from multiple fermentation containers stored in an unventilated below-ground room. Over time, the gas displaced oxygen in the lower part of the space, creating a low-oxygen environment. The case was ruled fatal carbon dioxide exposure due to confined space conditions. Afterward, the property was cleared of all stored fermentation materials, and ventilation systems were added. The containers themselves showed no external warning signs. The risk came from the enclosed space and the gradual buildup of gas that could not disperse. It was October 18, 2019, in Jamaica's Blue Mountains. Rain had just cleared, leaving the campsite damp and quiet beneath the trees. Students settled into their tents after a long hike with nothing out of place. By midnight, that calm had broken, one tent falling silent for reasons no one yet understood. Chloe Bennett, 20, was part of a university field group on an environmental study trip. She joined for both credit and the experience, known among her classmates as curious and willing to try new things. After several days of hiking through rural trails, the group had grown more comfortable moving through the area. That afternoon, while passing a cluster of trees, Chloe noticed several ackee fruits still closed on the branches and some scattered on the ground. With no clear understanding of how the fruit should be handled, she picked a few, assuming they could be opened and eaten later, treating them like other fruits they had come across during the trip. The fruits were firm and sealed, their outer skin not yet naturally split, an early stage where the inner flesh is not considered safe to eat. Back at the campsite that evening, the group settled in after dinner, relaxed and tired from the day. With no sense of urgency or concern, Chloe brought out the ackee she had collected. The fruits were still closed, but she cut them open herself and began passing around small portions to a few classmates, treating it like a simple snack. The seeds were removed, but the pale flesh remained dense and slightly rubbery, different from fully ripened ackee, though no one reacted to it at the time. Most only tasted small amounts before moving on. Chloe and two others ate more than the rest, finishing most of what had been collected. After a while, the moment passed, and everyone returned to their tents. The campsite grew quiet as the night settled in. Roughly 6 hours later, just after midnight, the first signs began to appear. One student woke up with sudden nausea that quickly turned into vomiting. In another tent, someone complained of stomach pain, followed by dizziness and weakness. Soon after, more students began waking up with similar symptoms. What started as 1 or 2 cases spread across the campsite, with multiple people experiencing severe stomach cramps and repeated vomiting. At first, it appeared to be food poisoning, but the progression didn't follow a typical pattern. Chloe's condition worsened faster than anyone else's. Her vomiting became frequent and forceful, leaving her struggling to catch her breath between episodes. She needed assistance to sit upright, her movement slowing as coordination began to decline. The two others who had eaten the most showed similar escalation, moving beyond stomach pain into visible weakness and instability. Chloe's vomiting suddenly slowed, then stopped. When classmates checked on her, her body began to convulse. Her muscles tightened, then released into irregular jerking movements. Her arms pulled inward while her legs moved unevenly against the ground. During one seizure, her jaw clenched and she bit her tongue, causing minor bleeding at the mouth. The convulsions came in bursts, decreasing in strength but becoming more irregular. Between episodes, her breathing became shallow and inconsistent, with brief pauses before each inhale. The two other students who had eaten the most were now in similar condition. One collapsed near his tent, unable to stand, his body going limp between episodes of muscle tightening. The other showed the same rapid decline, progressing from vomiting to loss of coordination soon after. Around them, at least 10 other students remained conscious but in distress, dealing with severe stomach pain, nausea, and repeated vomiting. The campsite, quiet moments earlier, shifted into confusion as people tried to help while managing their own symptoms. Emergency services were called, but the remote terrain delayed access. Coordinates were relayed through a satellite phone. By the time paramedics arrived, Chloe was unresponsive, and 2 others were in critical condition with irregular breathing. Treatment began on site before all were transported out. Chloe and the 2 who had eaten the most ackee died shortly after reaching the hospital. 10 others were admitted for monitoring. The cause was confirmed as hypoglycin A, poisoning from unripe ackee, leading to severe hypoglycemia and neurological failure. The case was classified as group poisoning, followed by stricter rules banning foraging during field trips. It was February 14, 2018, And a chocolate factory on the outskirts of Brock was running non-stop to meet Valentine's Day demand. The air smelled of warm chocolate as production lines moved continuously, pushing out batch after batch with little pause. Workers moved faster than usual, trying to keep up with orders that had to be finished on time. Ilara Favre, 30, worked in quality control near the main processing area. Her job was to check batches as they moved through heating and mixing, watching for anything that didn't meet standards. She was known for catching small issues others missed, but that day the pace left little room for slowing down. After hours on shift, she had already inspected dozens of batches, moving between stations as production continued without interruption. Behind the main line sat a large enclosed mixing tank used to liquefy chocolate in bulk. It handled large volumes, heating and holding chocolate before it moved further down the system. Cleaning and maintenance were routine, but only after full shutdown, cooling and ventilation. Those steps were strict for a reason, but they also took time, and time was limited that day. Earlier that morning, a minor issue had been reported near the lower valve of the tank. A small blockage had slowed part of the flow. It wasn't unusual during heavy production, and most cases were handled quickly without major concern. The line was placed into a short maintenance pause, and a cleaning-in-place cycle was started using an alkaline solution commonly used for food equipment. The system had been briefly adjusted before continuing operation, and from the outside, everything appeared normal. Records later showed the rinse cycle ended early, leaving residual chemical in the lower piping and valve assembly. Later in the process, a batch from that system reached the testing station. Ilara collected a sample, following routine procedure, and allowed it to cool briefly before testing, and tasted a small amount to check consistency and flavor. It was something she had done many times before, part of the job and usually safe under controlled conditions. Within seconds, something felt off. The taste was slightly bitter, not what she expected. At first, it didn't seem serious. The reaction came quickly. She immediately pulled away and spat out what remained, but a burning sensation had already spread across her mouth and throat. A burning sensation followed, then coughing and throat irritation as her breathing began to tighten. She stepped back from the station, trying to steady herself, but her balance gave way. A second worker nearby, who had also sampled the same batch, began showing similar signs. He slowed down, gripping the edge of the counter as his breathing became uneven. Another worker noticed both of them struggling and immediately called for help. The area was cleared as more workers who had tasted the sample started reporting symptoms. Some felt nausea and confusion, while others struggled to stay upright. Several complained of severe throat pain, vomiting, and difficulty swallowing. Even small amounts were enough to trigger a noticeable reaction. Emergency responders treated the workers on site before transporting the most severe cases. Ilara was struggling to breathe, her airway swelling and restricting airflow. Another worker was in critical condition. At the hospital, Ilara was pronounced dead after her condition deteriorated. The cause was consistent with severe airway compromise from chemical burns. Another worker later died from complications, while several others survived under monitoring. The investigation found that a cleaning chemical had not been fully flushed from the system, contaminating the chocolate as it passed through. Even small amounts were toxic when ingested. The case was officially recorded as a fatal food poisoning incident caused by accidental chemical contamination during production. It was not the recipe itself that caused harm, but what had been left behind inside the system. Afterward, the factory enforced stricter separation between cleaning procedures and active production. Full flushing and verification became mandatory before any system could be used again, and sampling procedures were adjusted to reduce direct exposure. It was May 6, 2017. During a festival in Guadalajara, the main square filled early with music, games, and rows of food stalls. Large cooking stations served hundreds as smoke and steam mixed with the smell of grilled meat, spices, and hot oil. Everything felt busy but controlled. Rafael Ortega, 42, was managing one of the busiest food stations that day. He had years of experience working festival events and was used to long hours, heavy workloads, and large cooking setups. In front of him sat an industrial steel cauldron, approximately 40 gallons in capacity, filled with spicy stew, chilies, meat, and oil, held at a sustained rolling simmer between 200 to 212 degrees Fahrenheit since morning to meet demand. From the outside, everything looked routine. People passed by, some watching, others lining up. By mid-afternoon, the stew had thickened. moving slower each time it was stirred. The surface held its shape longer than before. Earlier, a metal lid had been placed loosely on top to speed up cooking. It stayed there for hours, slightly off-center but covering most of the opening. The lid shifted now and then, giving off a faint rattle that blended into the noise of the festival. Conversations continued, music played, and orders were called out. Up close, the surface stayed mostly still between stirs. The lid lifted slightly at times, releasing short bursts of steam before settling again. At around 3:18 in the afternoon, Raphael stepped closer to check the consistency of the stew. He reached for the lid and lifted one side, just enough to look inside. The moment the lid moved, everything changed. The partial release of trapped steam disrupted the surface stability of the superheated pockets below. The built-up heat and steam released rapidly. Instead of a single explosion, the reaction occurred as a violent boil-over, with superheated steam and boiling stew surging upward in a sudden, forceful eruption. The lid was thrown aside, and the thick mixture sprayed outward in every direction. What had been contained inside the pot for hours suddenly had nowhere to go but out. Raphael stood closest, about 1 to 2 feet from the cauldron. He took the full impact as steam and boiling liquid erupted outward. The mix of steam and oil caused immediate third-degree burns to his face, chest, and arms. A second worker was hit across the upper body and face, suffering severe burns and inhalation injury. Others nearby were struck by splashes. The reaction lasted seconds, but the damage was immediate. The burner was shut off as people pulled back. Some collapsed near the station, while others stumbled away, trying to remove the hot mixture. Oil clung to clothing and skin, prolonging the burns. Responders arrived within minutes. Raphael was unresponsive with extensive burns and no pulse. The second worker was in critical condition with breathing difficulty. Both later died, Raphael at the scene, the second at the hospital, while others were treated on site. The investigation identified a pressure-driven boil-over caused by thick stew trapping steam under a partially covered lid. When lifted, it destabilized the surface and released the trapped heat rapidly. It was November 14, 2015, along the waterfront in General Santos. The pier was dim, lit by weak yellow lights that barely reached the water. Most boats had docked hours earlier, leaving the area quiet, with only a few workers sitting near the edge in the still, humid night. Among them was Mario Ramos, 35, a quiet and steady worker who had only been there a few weeks. He took every extra shift he could get, rarely saying no because most of what he earned went straight to his daughter's chemotherapy treatments. That night had been especially long, stretching past 16 hours, and by the time the work slowed down, he was running on almost nothing. He hadn't eaten a proper meal all day, and the fatigue was starting to settle deep into his body. Instead of spending his last money, Mario noticed small fish gathering near the dock lights. It wasn't unusual, and without thinking much, he grabbed a nearby net and scooped a handful in one motion. Another worker joined him, then a third, and within minutes they had enough for a quick meal. They rinsed the fish in seawater but didn't sort them carefully. Under the dim light, everything looked the same, small, silver, and easy to mistake. Someone added vinegar and salt, mixed it in a plastic container, and they ate together, passing it around without a second thought. At first, nothing seemed off. The conversation continued, low and tired, as they sat along the dock. After some time, Mario paused mid-sentence. He brought his fingers to his lips and rubbed them together, then wiped his hand on his shirt. His jaw moved unevenly, like chewing had suddenly become difficult to control. He tried to keep talking, but his words started to come out slurred, not matching what he was trying to say. One of the others laughed at first, thinking he was just exhausted, maybe lightheaded from the long shift. Across from him, another worker went quiet. He shifted his weight and braced one hand on the dock, adjusting his posture as if trying to steady himself. His fingers began flexing repeatedly, opening and closing in short, uncontrolled movements. Mario tried to stand, pushing himself up with one hand, but his legs gave out immediately. He collapsed back down, unable to hold his weight. Another worker staggered backward, hitting a crate behind him before dropping to his knees. The third man, who had eaten less than the others, began breathing faster, then unevenly, like his chest wasn't working the way it should. That was when the panic started to spread. From a distance, it didn't look like choking. No one was grabbing their throat or gasping for air in a way people usually recognize. Instead, their bodies were shutting down in stages. First their speech, then their movement, and then their breathing started to weaken. One worker tried to pull Mario from the dock, but his strength gave out and he collapsed beside him. Someone called for help using a mobile phone from the loading area nearby, but by then 2 men were already unresponsive. When responders arrived roughly 10 to 15 minutes later, they found both men lying supine on the dock, with shallow or absent breathing and weak pulses. Basic airway support and oxygen were initiated on site, but neither regained effective respiration. Post-incident reports identified tetrodotoxin exposure, a small pufferfish, visually similar in size and color to the other catch under low light, had been included in the mixture and consumed. The toxin blocks voltage-gated sodium channels, preventing nerve signals from reaching muscles. This leads to progressive paralysis, starting with facial numbness and loss of coordination, followed by limb weakness and eventually respiratory muscle failure. There are no visible external injuries. 2 workers were pronounced dead at the scene. A third survived after intensive care. The case was recorded as accidental food poisoning from a toxic marine species. Afterward, warnings were issued against eating unsorted small fish, especially at night when visibility is low.